One of my special guests this year for Veterans Day is Mrs. Lisa Isaac Macvittie. She is truly a remarkable woman and a remarkable American patriot, and I welcome you to the Watchman Report.
Thank you.
She was 7 years old when her Jewish family fled from the Nazis and walked from Nazi Germany to Switzerland. They then walked through the Brenner Pass, or what she calls St. Bernard's Pass, into Italy. She does not remember how they got to the port in Italy, but they fled Italy to get away from the Nazis and went to Shanghai, China. Since almost no nation on the face of the earth was taking in Jews, the family sailed to Shanghai, China, where her family was once again confronted by the Nazi threat. During that period of time, approximately 20,000 Jews fled to Shanghai, China. Approximately 90,000 fled from Nazi Germany to America, and close to 83,000 fled to Central and South America. From 1937 to 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army brutally occupied China. Germany and Japan were partners in the Evil Axis alliance. The Nazis pressured the Japanese to hand over all the Jews who were in China, specifically in Shanghai. The Japanese and the Germans made an agreement whereby the Jews who arrived in China after 1937 were thrown into concentration camps run by the cold-blooded Japanese. Lisa and her family languished in China until 1949, where they were finally able to come to the United States. Lisa then became a teacher and was in the U.S. Air Force. As I said, she is truly a remarkable patriot. If you were to see her front yard and her house, you would say a true patriot lives here. The hand of God is truly upon her and her family. She told me that her father had a photographic memory, and both her son and her grandchild seem to have inherited that capability, along with the capability to work at a high level in the computer industry, in the medical field originally.
Well,
Yeah.
he started in it, but he never completed it.
Okay.
He left it.
He could have completed it, but he decided to go towards another profession. So I am honored to have you here today and to hear your life story and that of your family. And if we could begin with the travel from Nazi Germany.
Okay, where do you want to start?
With you being in the
Okay.
body cast.
Oh, yeah. I was lucky enough to have polio at that time, so they put me in a cast to make sure my legs would grow straight. Actually, I was in the cast when they determined I had the polio. I had done something to my back and couldn't walk. So I was in the cast in 1938, November 9th, 1938 was what they call Kristallnacht, which is the night that the Nazis destroyed all the Jewish temples, businesses, destroyed the whole Jewish communities, all their books they burned, anything they could do. Now this was in Berlin. I don't know about the rest of the country because I wouldn't know that. So at that time, my parents had decided it was time that we got out of Germany. My grandparents, on the other hand, felt that this would blow over because he says they'll blow off a little steam and they'll be all over. But my father and my uncle were not sure of that, so my uncle and my aunt's father traveled with us. We left Berlin on the 23rd of July, 1939, and we were on foot, and we made our way through to the Alps, and as he was telling you, in the Alps, the junction there, the St. Bernard's Path, there was a train there that we could catch into Italy, but we had to catch a specific train. Now, I don't know exactly why we had to catch a specific train. I'm assuming here that there was either a conductor that wasn't looking too close at the documentation that my parents had, or somebody that's closed their eyes to Jews moving out of the country without any.
Sort of an underground railroad.
Yeah, something like that. I don't know. I'm just assuming this because I know there was a big rush on. Now, the night that we left Berlin, my grandmother took my hand and she put something in it. And it was a necklace with a tiny Star of David on it. And she says, now when it's okay and your mom and dad say it's okay to wear it, I'd like you to wear that. Of course, my mother took the necklaces. She gave one to my sister also. My mother took the necklaces and put them in the back of that stroller they had rigged up. There was a pocket back there, and she put it way down in the bottom. So when we got to the St. Bernard's path, there was a lot of hurry to get on that train. My uncle and my father threw us kids on the train, told us to sit in the cabin. They had little compartments and not to say a word. So that's exactly what we did. And as the train pulls out, my mother sees that stroller sitting on the tarmac out there yet. So from the time we hit Rome to the time from that time when we left the St. Bernard's path till we hit Rome, they had no way of transporting me other than to carry me. So they carried me, and I don't recall how we got from Rome to Naples. But then again, I was 7 years old, and I had to be carried everywhere they went because there was a cast on me. I couldn't walk. So my uncle and my dad took turns carting me around in what I call my 50-pound cast. I don't know how much it really weighed. It was just a statement. And we made our way to Naples. In Naples, we caught a Japanese cruise liner that went all the way around through the Suez Canal and all the way around India and coming up the far side of India, up to China, coming around Hong Kong, first to Ceylon and then on to Hong Kong and all the way up to finally to Shanghai.
So once again, this was in 1939.
Right.
So the Pacific portion of the war, excluding China,
Yeah.
had not begun between the United
right.
States, Great Britain,
Right,
and Japan.
that didn't start until 42, after Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor, 7 December 1941.
Right. Oh, 41, not 42. Anyways, so when we landed in Shanghai, China had just gone through a horrific war with Japan, the Sino-Japanese War, and Shanghai was flat from end to end. Here we're getting off of a luxury liner, and I still see my mother standing there saying to my father, Colt, what have we gotten ourselves into? I mean, the stench over there, the dead bodies everywhere, the streets, the filth was horrifying for my mother, who made Mr. Clean look dirty. And, it was just, for her, this must have been horrifying. There was no housing available anywhere. The Chinese didn't have a place to live. It was all bombed out. So there was a large Jewish community from hundreds of years ago, like the Sassoons and the Kaduri families, they're big families, and they supported this influx of Jews. And they had set up a temporary, like a big gymnasium with cots in it, temporarily until they could find homes, or we could find homes.
Now, many Americans will recognize that name of Vidal Sassoon,
Yeah.
but I never realized that they were Shanghai Jews.
Well, they were actually Indian. I believe they were out of India originally.
Okay.
But they were represented there very well, like Kaduris. They ran all the schools, all the English schools. Now, Sir Kaduri, Horace Kaduri was his name, and he was knighted by the Queen of England. It's an unusual situation. The Queen knighted an Indian Jew, so he was Sir Kaduri. And they owned all the English schools in China. And of course, these are bigwig people, they did a lot for the country, and the Japanese really didn't have a problem with us because now Japan owned China. There's so many wars involved in all this, a lot of people can't realize how tightly these wars are really united.
Let me give a little bit of historical background on that. The Shanghai Ghetto, formerly known as the Restricted Sector for Stateless Refugees, and you and your family were stateless refugees, was an area approximately 1 square mile in the Hongkou district of Japanese-occupied Shanghai, to which 23,000 Jewish refugees were relocated by the Japanese when they issued a proclamation called the Proclamation Concerning Restriction of Residence and Business of Stateless Refugees. And these were people who had fled German-occupied.
That came in after 1937.
Right.
You see, they settled, Japan and Germany settled their problem with over the Jews. Germany demanded that all the Jews be annihilated, and Japan said, we don't have a problem with them. These are our business people. And so they finally settled with the 1937 cutoff, and they said because everybody that came there after 1937 obviously was running from the Nazis. So that's...
The refugees were settled in the poorest and most crowded area of the city. Local Jewish families and the American Jewish Charities aided them with shelter, food, and clothing. The Japanese authorities increasingly stepped up restrictions, but the ghetto was not walled, and the local Chinese residents, whose living conditions were often as bad, did not leave. The International Settlement of Shanghai was established by the Treaty of Nanking. The police jurisdiction and passport control were implemented by the Foreign Autonomous Board. Under the unequal treaties between China and European countries, visas were only required to book tickets departing from Europe. So that was a good thing.
Yeah.
All you needed was a visa to get out.
But China was, or Shanghai was the only open port in the world. Even America did not allow Jews in anymore because they were so afraid of Hitler.
You'll recall the ship, the St. Louis, which left Nazi Germany with German Jews, initially went to Cuba, was rejected from Cuba, then sailed to the United States, and FDR and the American government refused the Jews to enter the United States, and they had to go back to Nazi Germany, where I believe most of those Jews ended up in Dachau.
Yeah.
Okay,
Now with us now, we picked up a Japanese liner, like I said, was the Terakuni Maru, and it was a wonderful ship. That was probably the last good times that my parents saw. My mother lived longer, but my father did not. So after we got off that ship, like you were saying, this Jewish community stepped up to the plate and they helped out. But then after 1941, even that was limited, very, very limited. So clothing for us, you know, children, if you don't feed them, they still grow, you know. Food was, we literally lived on cornmeal mush. Now it's cornmeal boiled in water, no salt, no sugar, no nothing with it. And our biggest enemy was not the Japanese, really, in a way. It was more the starvation and, you know, the living conditions as a whole. Like, they moved us into an old university building. And like, we were up on the 3rd floor, my family, and it was a room just not as big as this down area here is, and we had 18 families in that room.
So there would have been 18 families in a room
And there were
this size.
there were 6 of my family. Now, my uncle and aunt, they were in another place, and her father. But my father, my mother had at that time given birth to another child.
Mhm.
So there were 6 of us alone in my family. So you can imagine the crowded conditions. For a little privacy, if the people had an extra sheet or blanket, you know, they'd string it over these mile-high beds. And there was no privacy. There was very little food. But one thing that I always thought of, even I think of quite often, as dire as the situation was, people were hungry. People were disconcerted, you know, they were just, I don't think there was much happiness there. But what I always remark at is the fact that nobody ever stole from anybody else in that camp that I know of. Nobody.
That's remarkable.
It is. Because when people are hungry, they will do a lot of things they normally would not do. So,
what was your interaction with the Japanese like?
well, when they first came onto the scene was after 1941, really, because that's when we were really tied down. And they allowed us to keep on going to school. So the Kaduris had enough pull. They told them they could keep the schools open. And we were allowed to go to the school. So the school became our local focus of everything. We had a flush toilet in the school. We only had outhouses over there that smelled 10 miles against the wind.
A flush toilet in the Orient in that time was a luxury.
Well, for that it was, yes. I used to wait until I got to school to go to the bathroom because these outhouses, they had blood-sucking spiders that would jump on you, and what little blood you had, then they'd just puff up. I don't know what they call those. They suck blood and then they puff up on the back, and you can't get rid of them.
I think they're called Nazi spiders.
Is that what they were? Instead of Nazi spies, they were Nazi spiders. And I just was deathly afraid of those things. Now, before we got to China, my older brother, who was a 14-year-old boy with a rather large imagination and telling his younger sisters horror stories. So while we were on board of that ship, he managed to tell my sister and me that if we hit a storm while we're out in the ocean and there's lightning and it hits the ship goes down, and he says, and you with your cast will never come up. And so I howled loud and clear up until my parents actually had him saw that cast off of me, because I wouldn't quit crying because I thought I was going to go to the bottom of the ocean and never come up again. So I was out of the cast while we were on the ship. And so when we got to China, I no longer had the cast on. And so it was just, actually, I learned to walk on that ship again. We were 6 weeks on the sea. In order to get from Italy to China, it took 6 weeks. And so here we were, young kids, still growing, and the clothes, my sleeves were getting shorter and shorter and shorter. My mother, who was a seamstress, managed to adjust as much as she could, and shoes were absolutely, if you didn't find an old pair from somewhere, you didn't have any.
Did the Japanese require the Jews to wear stars?
No, we also were not tattooed.
Okay.
So like I say, they really weren't that much into handling the Jews. They weren't that much against it. We were not, by the Japanese, the man in charge of that Hongkou area, his name was Goya. And he was a nasty little man. He was only about 5 foot tall. And my father was 6'4", and whenever he tried to get a point across, he always picked on the tallest people, and then he'd stand on his desk and smack him across the face. That gave him a thrill, I guess. But that, as far as the actual cruelty that was in Germany against people, we did not face. Now, the hunger, yes. The deprivation of everything, yes, but I think the Germans were far more physically cruel. As long as we left them alone, the Japanese. My father said, leave the guards alone. They're just doing their job. So we were told to stay away from them, which we didn't always do. We used to taunt them a bit. But that's kids. They're kids no matter what the situation is. And so then along comes the end of the war. After the first week of euphoria, you realize there's really no place to go because the bombings from the Allies, the bombings from...
The Americans had begun bombing Shanghai.
Yeah, and all of that, what wasn't bombed out before was now definitely bombed out. So there was no place to go, and we stayed in that camp, even though we had freedom, but we still stayed there. And it was just, the years went by. I lost a sister during the war.
You told me another remarkable thing, that in the midst of all this, or before you went to fled Nazi Germany, that your mother actually adopted another child.
Well, no, we did that in China. That was in Shanghai, yes.
Okay.
My parents, my father had a friend who was my father's age, who had a Bardat wife of 16. She was 16 years old and was delivering a second child. And well, he'd taken her to China. And this young girl was just too petrified to stay with us. And she had an option to still be in China, but she couldn't take her children with her. And she ultimately married another man, but she left him with a brand new baby and a 2-year-old. So my mother had sent my father out to do some shopping. This was before the war. And my father comes back with a brand new baby. And my mother says, Kurt, for heaven's sake, where'd you get that baby? He says, come on, you can take care of that. And it belonged to a gentleman that my father knew. That was the father of the child. He could take care of the 2-year-old, but he didn't know how to take care of the newborn one. So my mother took care of the newborn one, whom we ultimately actually lost at some point during the war. They had moved us around, and we were separated.
And what was her name?
Daisy was her given name.
Daisy? Okay.
We used to call her Pippi.
Pippi? Okay.
No, wait a minute, that wasn't Pippi. Pippi was my real sister. That was, Daisy had another name. We had a pet name for her.
Okay, at any rate,
Yeah.
you somehow lost contact with Daisy.
We lost her somewhere, and my mother had assumed she'd gotten killed. Because she was just a little girl then. By that time, she was like 2.5 years old. And and you took it for granted. If you didn't come back, you were dead. You know, that was the lifestyle.
But you told me that, much to your shock and surprise, years later you found that Daisy was alive.
Yeah, she's alive, and she lived in England. She was taken over to Australia by a single lady who happened to have been in China. She hid her and ultimately took her to Australia, where she grew up. And then from Australia, she went to England for further education.
Okay.
And she married and had children of her own.
And you reunited with her?
Quite by chance. There was definitely some intervention there somewhere. My husband, my mother, and I were going to take a European tour. And we had earlier in 1980, we had a reunion of some of the survivors of that camp in San Francisco, and they made up a flyer-type newspaper. So every other month, you know, they have articles in of people wanting to know who's where and what did they do and all this. And there appeared this article of this young woman wanting to know if anybody knew her family. And there was no question it was her. So I called London, and she said, well, they were leaving. Her husband was being stationed to Japan, and they were leaving for Japan the same week that we were arriving in England. So there was no way we could get together. And about 2 weeks later, she called me back, and she says they moved her husband's trip up by 2 weeks. So we got to England, and my mother got to meet her again. It was amazing. She was a spitting image of her own biological mother. We knew her biological mother. So it was kind of nice for my mom. Very nice.
Now, you told me that your grandparents were from the World War I generation, and they found it very difficult to believe what the Nazis were up to.
That's right.
Kind of tell that story.
Well, my grandfather was a decorated German officer from the First World War. And he kept saying, this isn't going to happen. This is going to blow over. You know, this is just some crazy idea.
Hitler was all talk.
Yeah. And, well, they tried to talk my uncle and my parents out of going. They said it was, you know, you're a German. You should support your country. Just like we tell our children, you're Americans.
Right.
Behave like one.
They love their country.
Right. And, well, my parents and my uncle just didn't go for that. They saw Kristallnacht, and that was it. That's when they decided, no, we're done, we're going, before we lose everything. And being that I was in a cast, I was labeled as a crippled child, so I'd have been one of the first ones to leave this world.
Yeah, that's something that Americans don't understand, that Hitler didn't just start mass murdering Jews. The first group he began to eliminate were the handicapped and the disabled.
And the old.
And the old.
And then, of course, after Kristallnacht, they went crazy. You know, Now, I was just invited by the German government to come over to Germany, to Berlin, and they were very, very gracious. And I feel sad for the German people now because this generation is feeling how could my grandparents have done this, is what they're saying. How could they have behaved like that? What was wrong with them? You know, and they're really feeling this, and they are doing something that is absolutely phenomenal. In Berlin, they have still, the side streets are still cobblestones because they're antiquity from the Roman era. And they leave the cobblestones on the side streets. And on any street where a Jewish family lived that they know about, they take one cobblestone out and they replace it with it's either brass or copper, but it's something hard and shiny that'll sustain walking on. Replace it with the name of the people that they lived there and the house they lived in, when they were taken out, and the date of their death.
There's a terrific movie called The Apartment, and they show that in Berlin
Do
and
they?
other cities where the government has put those little plaques in the sidewalk.
Well, this is cobblestones, and they're called stumblestones, if I translate German to English. And the brass stone is just a fraction of an inch higher than the cobblestone. So when you walk, you tap your toe, and when you tap your toe, you automatically look down. And they want their people to see this.
That's interesting because the Bible says that Jerusalem will be a stumbling stone for all the nations of the world.
I didn't know that, see? But
I just wanted to relate a brief story about the interaction of the Jews with the Japanese in Shanghai. A group of Jews met with the Japanese governor, and the Japanese governor asked the Jews, he didn't understand it. He said, "Why do the Germans hate you Jews so much?" And one of the Jews allegedly replied, "Because we are Oriental and we're small and we're dark." And apparently that created a
rapport with them.
A
of some
rapport
kind?
with the Japanese who could understand that type of discrimination.
Like if my uncle, for instance, he was an artist, a phenomenal artist. And he managed during the war, he had to get special permission from this Mr. Goya, and he took the abuse from the men, the verbal abuse and everything else. It was nothing serious, it was just demeaning, you know, and he took that, but he got a pass that he could work for this one art outfit. So he would be able to go out of Hong Kong to go to work every day and come back. And there were certain positions that they would allow this to. Now my mother, for one, would go out of Hong Kong because my mother was not Jewish, and my mother was a Lutheran. And if my mother had divorced my father, she could have lived in decent living in Shanghai somewhere, not in the Hong Kong area. But we children couldn't go, and my mother.
And she could have even stayed in Germany if
she could have. Yes, if she divorced my father. As a matter of fact, they urged that these women that are married to Jewish men or men to Jewish women to divorce. That's what they urged them to do. And my mother said, "No, I am married. I took an oath, and I will stay." And she stayed with us, but her card that we had to carry was like a passport almost, only just a card. Instead of having a yellow line which indicated Jews, had a green line on top of it. So with that, my mother, with permission from Goya, could get out of the camp, and she would go out, and there was a Red Cross station, and she would try and bring in medicines and stuff like that. But it was, a very dangerous thing for her to do, because if they'd have caught what she was doing, they might not have been so generous, but she never did get caught at it. But
I wanted to point out that later in the war, the Japanese, as you said, moved you again.
Mm-hmm.
And this time they moved you to an area that was, let me find it here. a squalid area of less than 1 square mile. Now, not only were the stateless refugees there, but there were 100,000 Chinese.
I mean, they'd have 15 people sleeping in one room, the Chinese. So when a European comes, they hardly would give up housing to them. So you see, there's a real problem for housing to begin with. We couldn't drink the water. The water would have killed us over there because it was so contaminated. So you had
So
to
did
boil.
you boil water?
They had to boil the water, but in order to boil the water, you had to have a stove to boil it on, or coal, or whatever you could use, which we didn't have. When we first got there, my mother and father went out and bought a kerosene stove. I don't know if any of you remember the old-fashioned kerosene stoves. You had to pump it up all the time so the kerosene kept flowing
I
up.
think one of our studio audience remembers.
You do. And so we had that. But then when we went into the district itself, when we were forced into the district, we didn't even have that. So somewhere along the line, my father came up with a little hibachi pot. You know, the Japanese hibachi pots. But then there's the thing, where do you get coal or wood or something? So it was really, whenever it was lit for a specific purpose. And so the food, the water, those were our main enemies. The dysentery, all of these things that come with no food or very poor food, and the squalid living. Cholera was rampant. And at one point, we had an epidemic of diphtheria.
Probably measles and mumps.
Well, I never had measles, mumps, or chicken pox, but I was during that age that I would get it. I was in the hospital in Germany still.
Okay.
So I don't know about that, but I do know the cholera and all of those kind of diseases were just rampant.
I want to mention some of the people who were there in that ghetto with you. It's a remarkable list of names. Aaron Eshmoff, who was a Russian composer, Charles K. Bliss, whose Chinese experience inspired him to create the Bliss symbols, W. Michael Blumenthal, who became U.S. Treasury Secretary, Morris Cohen, known by his nickname of Two Gun Cohen. Did you know him?
No, I don't think so.
Well, Two Gun Cohen was the bodyguard and aide-de-camp to Sun Yat-sen, the first president of the Chinese Republic, and became a Chinese general. These are all Jewish people.
Yeah.
Shaul Eisenberg, who founded and ran Eisenberg Group of companies in Israel. Gunther Gassenheimer, rabbi. Edward Glass, Austrian chess master.
That's
Eric
why we played
Halpern,
chess.
Please?
Maybe that's why we learned to play chess.
Probably. Eric Halpern, a co-founder of the Far Eastern Economic Review. Another rabbi, Zev Volvar-Gordon. Leo Hannon, leader of the Shanghai Batar. Otto Joachim, a German composer. Vivian Jeanette Kaplan, author of the 10 Green Bottles book. Frank Mankiewicz, Canadian film producer, screenwriter, and producer. Peter Max, American pop artist. Michael Medvedev, a Hollywood executive at Columbia Pictures, Orion, and TriStar. Jacob Rosenfeld, more commonly known as General Luo, who spent 9 years overseeing the health care and served as Minister of Health for Mao Zedong. An impressive list of people. And it continues. I mean, there's more here. Lawrence Tribe, professor at Harvard Law School. So you were with a distinguished group of people.
Well, actually, there was a whole group of people that consisted of a whole opera group. And they somehow got thrown in with us. I don't know whether they came by themselves or I don't know, but we were introduced to opera. That was our type of music. To this day, I still listen to opera because I like it. But they put on performances out of nowhere. And then there was this one comedian, a German comedian, that was with us over there, and they would put on actual, very funny and very good performances to keep the spirit of the people up. And our education over there was phenomenal because we had professors from all over the world teaching grade school and high school and the early college years, because they were there and we were there. They weren't paid for this. They were just, doing their part. And
So in August 1945, the war ends.
right.
Did the Americans show up? What happened
The
in
Allies
Shanghai?
came in. The Allies came in they expected a battle at Shanghai, but they didn't get it. The Japanese just handed them the key to the town. There was no in-town fighting. They were hoping for that. The Allies did because, there's so many civilians. China is so populated. There's so many thousands of people. We think New York is crowded or Chicago is crowded. That's nothing compared to what China's cities are. Even to this day in Shanghai, my husband and I went to China 4 years ago, just before he passed away. And the population hasn't changed any. It is just massive. And so they were hoping that they wouldn't have to fight the streets.
Did you recognize any of the old landmarks or places where you had been?
You have to look hard, but yeah. We went back, well, actually we came into, we went mostly to parts that I hadn't seen before.
Okay.
But we did end up in Shanghai and we did go to Hong Kong. And when you look at Hong Kong, it hasn't changed a bit behind the facade. All you have to do is look a little deeper. They still have the bamboo rods on the roof gardens, the part of the roof that's flat. They got bamboo rods to hang their clothes out to dry. That's all still the same. And there's a Jewish temple that was on Chusong Road, and we went to find it because I heard that they had restored it. So, because you wander the streets over there, it doesn't really look like anything you remembered. And in my best remembered Chinese, I stopped the gentleman and asked for direction, and he very promptly replied in a beautiful English saying, "I will walk with you." We were within walking distance, so he said, "I'll walk with you." And he walked us right there to it. Now that temple was restored. The alcove for the Torah is still there. The classrooms, like they have here in the church, they're different classrooms. And that has been restored to what it was. And it was just, in that temple, there was an 80-year-old gentleman there that was that's made into a museum type stuff. And he asked me, when he found out that I was one of the people that used to live there, and he says, are you in the register? There's a whole book, a register of all people that had lived in 1939 through some year there. He asked me, are you registered in that? I says, yes. And he says, can you show me? So he brought out this book, and I showed him, and he looked at the address. This was the address that my parents had first found a house after we got there. We finally found a place for us to live, to get out of that settlement that the Jewish community had set up. So he looked at this address and he started laughing. He says, you and I probably crossed paths. I says, why? He says, I lived one lane down for you up until 2 years ago when they made me move into a senior citizen's house. So he was a jolly little fella.
Lisa, did you ever find out what happened to your grandparents?
Just past 2 years, actually. My grandfather was hauled out in 1942. In the middle of the night, they came to drag him out of the house. And my grandparents had a big German Shepherd, and of course when they came through the door, the dog attacked. And they shot the dog, and my grandfather was directly behind them. They shot my grandfather right there. And my grandmother they took with them, but I could never find out where they went with her. I looked in all the German concentration camps and I couldn't find any result of her. Up until about 2 years ago, there's a Holocaust museum here, and one of the members from the American Legion Post told me about it, and he said they would like to talk to you. I says, okay, I'll talk to them. So when I was done talking to the lady, that museum, by the way, is very, very tastefully done, very nicely done. So as we were getting ready to leave, I said to the lady from the museum there says, to this day I have no clue what happened to my grandmother. She just disappeared off the face of the earth, and that doesn't happen. The entire molecular structure of a human being doesn't disappear. So she says, well, can you give me some more information on her? Well, I knew my grandmother's maiden name, I knew her birth date, I knew quite a bit about my grandparents. My parents saw to that we knew our families, because they knew that we'd lost them, so we needed to know them. So she goes to her computer, and pretty soon she comes out with a printout. They had registered my grandfather as a free man. He died a free man. Obviously, they didn't get him out of the house. They killed him first. So he was a free man. And my grandmother, they took from Berlin. They took her to Czechoslovakia, from Czechoslovakia to Poland, and from Poland to northern Russia, where they finally annihilated her. All that in an 8 months period. So the Jewish Family Services over here, they have a young man there, had a young man, he's gone back to Germany, he's a German boy, and he was here on a service-related thing for a year. They come in for a year, and then they go back to Germany. It's part of their education. And he was over in Germany yet, and they contacted him through the same organization, his sister organization, and he went out and found the cemetery that my grandfather was actually buried in. And he took a picture of it, they emailed it to me. My grandfather's headstone had been broken in half. It was standing up, it had been broken in half, and was just laying there. So this young man, then it was his turn to come to the States. He and I talked to, contacted really, what do you call them, the people that make the memorials or the headstones in Germany. And I hired them and had them redo my grandfather's grave. And since now I knew what happened to my grandmother, I had them put that information also on that headstone, also the date she was killed, and the fact that it was part of the Holocaust. It was all on that headstone now. So when I went to Germany here this past July, they took us to the cemetery there, and it was very nicely done. I was very pleased with the job they did.
Well, now when the war ended in 1945, you just didn't automatically leave China, go into that period of your life.
Okay, so here you are, after the euphoria, the war is over. Well, it doesn't mean everybody packs up their package and goes home. There is no home to go to. We were stateless. And sure, we had availability for a job. My father immediately got a job with the American Allies. He knew how to drive a truck. Very few men knew how to drive a truck in those days. They didn't even know how to drive cars then. It's not like now, when you're 16, you fly an airplane like my grandson. But my father got a job with the, what was the BX or the PX at the time, the Post Exchange. And we started picking up. We had food, but housing was still ridiculous to even think
Were you all still living in that 1 square mile?
Yeah, we had stayed in that long 1 square mile because that was the only place you could get a place. So finally, after I don't know how many months, my father got a 3-room apartment for us. And it consisted of a bedroom, a living room, and something that my mother made into a kitchen. The building had 1 bathroom for the whole building, and the water was downstairs. You had to go downstairs, and the building was built in a square, and then like a hole, like a chimney in the middle downstairs. It was a 4-sided building, which is quite common over there for apartments. And so if we wanted water, we had to go downstairs and get the water and bring it upstairs. So, and the same thing with the bathroom. My mother we used to have a bucket of water and then a bowl, and that's what we washed up. There was no shower or anything like that. We weren't that luxurious. And, I don't remember anybody smelling bad, because we all probably did. We certainly looked bad. But so we got things pretty much going, and we were 2 years into it when my father got killed. And so
What happened to your father?
well, he got murdered. I don't know why for sure. By that time it was 1948. The police told my mother that they're fairly certain that this was not an accident, that he was murdered. He says, now we have a choice to make. It was 48. The communists were coming in fast and furious. They knew we all tried to get out of China. And so they said we can document this as one of two things. If we document it as an accident, that does not blackball you from the getting out of China. If we document it as a murder, you have to remain until courts and everything gets through. And we have no way of telling you when. So my mother talked it over with my sister and myself, and she says, your father is dead either way, it does not matter. We need to get out of here. So we opted to go with the accident. So here's my mother. In the meantime, my mother had my younger brother after the war. She has this 2-year-old baby, and she has 2 teenage girls, and no money, absolutely no money. What we had, this goes back to my father's death, really. Money, the devaluation of the yuan over there was so horrific. My mother took a basket full of money to the store and came back with a half a basket full of potatoes. You know, it had devaluated so much. So my father bought gold bars. You could buy little bitty gold bars. And that's how, because investing the money over there was useless, but gold would always hold. And we had a false drawer in one of our cabinets. And the only ones I really knew about where that money was were 2 or 3 people. And one of these 2 or 3 people were very obviously not at my father's funeral. He was supposedly be my father's friend. So he evidently, 2 or 3 days after, my mother settled everything down. She says, I got to find out what we have because we got to get out of here. She opened up that false drawer and it was empty. So we had nothing.
So your father was probably murdered for the little gold bars.
I think there was other reasons there
Okay.
too, but I couldn't prove any of it because I was 16 years old, you know, and a 16-year-old has a pretty vivid imagination sometimes.
So once again, your mother is penniless.
Penniless. We had $2.50, $2.50 when we came to America. And that was the honest to goodness story. Actually, my mother had $2.75 by the time we got here. The President Truman ordered his troop ships to turn around and pick up everybody they could out of China, out of Shanghai. Because he said, these people have had enough, bring them out, we'll sort through them and see what we do with them. I guess the guilt was already there, realizing they were turned back the first time by even the United States.
So President Truman was not only instrumental
No,
in the creation of the nation of Israel,
no,
he literally ordered troop ships to turn around
that's right.
and help the persecuted Jews.
So I came over on the SS Gordon, and they had slot machines on the Gordon for the troops. This was acceptable during those days. And I'm walking down.
Those were the good old days.
Yeah, oh, is that what it was?
When they had slot machines
Yeah.
and the PXs and stuff.
I was walking down one of these aisles there where they had the slot machines, and there was a nickel laying on the floor. I picked it up, and there was a guy playing the machine. I tried to give it him. He says, "That's mine." I says, "Well, what do I do with it?" He says, "Put it in the machine." And out came 5 nickels. So that's how my mother wound up with $2.75. So, like I say, there are good sides to all these stories. So when we get to Hawaii, they were sorting through all the immigration stuff. They started there and then on into San Francisco. And the gentleman in Hawaii that was sorting through our stuff said to my mother, "Mrs. Isaac, why don't you let me just add a couple of zeros to that $2.75? And my mother says, "Well," my mother didn't speak English. I had to translate, okay? She says, "Well, that's all I have." He says, "Yeah, but," he says, "when you get to San Francisco, they see $2.75. Even in 1949, that wasn't enough to go out for dinner." And he says, this way you won't run through too many objections. People get too suspicious. Just let me add it to him. And I said, whatever you say, you know. I mean, these were the officials telling me to add 2 zeros on it if I had it or not, you know, and that would make it easier for her. So we got to San Francisco, and when we got off the ship,
How old are you now?
81.
No, I mean back in
Oh, back then, 16.
1949.
16. I was
16.
headed for 17.
Okay.
So, but it was just when we were there at the pier where they let us off the ship, because you figure one of those troop ships holds a lot of people. As it turned out, this was the last trip that the SS Gordon made into Shanghai Harbor before they closed the curtain. And we made it out on the last ship. It was the last run she had. I just researched that on the internet.
Okay.
And
by the curtain, you mean the bamboo curtain?
yeah, the bamboo curtain, right.
It was the Iron Curtain in Europe and the bamboo curtain in China.
They always have curtains or walls. Speaking of walls, there's another thing really. In Berlin, where the Berlin Wall was, all the way through the city, they have a path this wide that indicates wherever the wall was. It's a red path that they laid out. They want their people to know. They want them to understand what can happen if you don't think things through properly.
You know what I find fascinating about that wall?
What's that?
What did Hitler do to the Jews? He put them in ghettos and built walls around them. And then after the war, God punished the German people by throwing up his wall.
Could be. That's a good way to look at it. I just feel sorry for the now generation, because these people, these young people, are really feeling this badly. Well, we were in Germany here a couple of months ago. I had a school teacher call and ask, could he come and talk to me? I says, well, they had set up a whole schedule for my brother. I mean, my brother went with me to Germany. And they had set up this whole schedule for us from 10 in the morning till whenever we got done at night. I said, it'd have to be after we get back to the hotel. He says, well, what is not too late? I says, anytime. So he came up and he brought his 13-year-old son with him. This gentleman was a history professor, and he had a 13-year-old son. He says, I teach history all day long, but me telling them this out of a book is not the same than him sitting here and talking to someone that actually was there. He says, what they learn in history is, to them, just a good old story. But the reality is gone of it. And this is actually why I do this, because I feel that the reality needs to be known. Another 20 years or so, there isn't going to be anybody left alive that can tell the story anymore.
And that includes the World War II fellows.
Yeah, they're already dying, 600 of them a day?
Yeah.
And in this community, you read off a whole bunch of interesting names. What's his name? Blumenthal.
Right.
His real name is Werner Michael Blumenthal, but if you look at the old dollar bill, he goes as Michael Blumenthal. Well, he and my brother fought the Second World War all by themselves. He and my brother were bosom friends and bosom enemies. And one time, the elderly Mr. Blumenthal came to my mother, and he had Werner in tow. Werner had a Shiner, and my father was complaining to my mother, you know, your son did this to my son. My mother turned around. She says, Achim, come here a minute. Here's Achim, black guy here. He took his son and walked away. These two boys were at it all the time. But in 1980, when we had this first reunion of what they called Shanghailanders, he walked in, Blumenthal walked in. My brother brought his son. My brother had very bright red hair. I mean, it was bright red. And he saw my nephew, who also, of course, inherited his father's red hair. And Eddie looks just like my brother. And he looked at him and he says to him, Mr. Blumenthal says to him, "Where's your old man?" And he looks at the sky, and he says, "It's over there." And the two of them were at it again. They just had a great old time laughing about the old days.
So now you're 16 years old.
Mm-hmm.
You're in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
What happens in your life then?
Well, I have an uncle and aunt that lived in New Jersey. They came to the States through Portugal, my father's sister and her husband.
So they had fled Nazi Germany
They had
also?
fled Nazi Germany, but not until 1942. They went to Canada first, and then from Canada came into New Jersey. Again, it's all part of the quota stuff.
Okay.
Quotas were almost impossible to get. And they lived in New Jersey. My uncle was a professor in New Jersey. And so anyways, they decided, my uncle and aunt sponsored us. So we had to get from San Francisco to Elizabeth, New Jersey, or Newark, New Jersey would be the port. Well, my mother had $2.75. So the organization that I know is HIAS. It's a Jewish organization that fish people out of hotspots in the world. They're not just helping Jewish people, they're helping any hotspot, getting them out of different countries.
Right.
And they arranged for us to get to Newark, and that was an experience. They put us on a Pullman train, and it went to Chicago. And from in Chicago, we had to change trains. When we arrived in Chicago, there was a lady standing there, big sign, Isaac. My mother says, "What is this?" I says, "I don't know, somebody called Isaac, So I went over there and I talked to the lady, and she said she was from the organization, and she's to take us to the other station. We had to switch stations. So she took us to the other station and put us on a train there. And of course, the language barrier sets in when we spoke Oxford English, and this was American English. Like, we're traveling, all the railway signs, there, big billboards, lots for sale. Finally, one of us, my sister and I would talk.
What was for sale?
Lots for sale.
Okay.
And to us, a lot isn't a lot. One of us said to the other one, "What do they have lots for sale of?" So there was a gentleman in the berth in front of us, and he comes up over the top like Kilroy, and he says, "Where are you two girls from?" So that was my first initiation in the language barrier.
Now, how did you end up in the Air Force?
Well, in 1954, 1954, November the 11th, I made my citizenship. And
So you were 20 or 21 years old?
yes, I was
Okay.
almost 22 by then. And this is something I wanted to do. I felt I owed this country something, and I didn't know how to repay it, and I figured, well, the military isn't a bad way to repay it. So I joined the service in December, the end of the last day of December. I was in Texas in little Abner boots and the whole works on the 1st of January. Although I did mention the fact that before I wore those boots, I'd have to be dead. So I must have been very dead the next day because I wore them. But
So now you're at Lackland Air Force Base.
And they decided I needed to teach. So I went teaching. I used to teach math and military law, which was an experience because I knew nothing about military law, but they sent you to a tech school to give you a brief indoctrination, and that's where I met my husband. I was teaching on one side of the hall, he was teaching on the other side of the hall. We'd give him a test and meet in the hall.
Okay.
Actually, I met him in the tech school, and we were married that November, following in 55. So
And you were married for
54 years when he passed away.
54 years.
Have 4 wonderful children. I've got 14 grandchildren, 19 great-grandchildren, with 1 more on the way, and 1 great-great-grandchild. So now I know why I was kept alive. All of these people would not have been born if I hadn't
Amen.
made it out.
The Lord had a mission for you.
That's it.
And you firmly believe that the Lord had his hand on you.
Somewhere. Somebody
Yeah.
was watching out for me.
Well, we believe here on the Watchman Report that those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed.
Well,
So,
no, I believe that you have to believe in something stronger than yourself. And in order to survive things, in order to make your life worthwhile. And mine certainly has been worthwhile. Watching my children grow up the way they did, they all turned out to be great people. That list of people that came out of that Shanghai ghetto there, every one of us has done well over here. I have not heard but of one person that has a sour attitude. The rest of them are all grateful that they got here. And I think the realization of freedom, when you realize that you're finally free, is, how do we want to put it? It's emotionally upheaval, because when we came under the Golden Gate Bridge with that ship, it was 2 a.m, every one of these people on that ship were on deck, and we all knew, hey, this is
I
going to
would
be
imagine there were quite a few tears.
Yeah. So, anyways, that's when you realize you're free and don't lose it.
Well, we're certainly glad that the Lord sent you to the United States.
I'm sure glad too, because I wouldn't have fared well in our other options was South America or Santo Domingo or Israel, and I don't think I'd have fared as well. I've come up very well. I've had a wonderful life, and you can't get that type of a life anywhere but here.
So through all the trials and turmoil that you went through, here you sit and say, I have had a wonderful life.
Sure. You compartmentalize everything. This is the first part here, Germany. China is another part. And then growing up here or coming here, then the military, and then the family. It's all in little boxes.
I would agree.
And you learn that these boxes all contain happiness and sadness. You can't experience happiness unless you've seen sadness, because you wouldn't know it. If you're always happy, you wouldn't know it, what sadness can be like. So,
Well, we're running out of time here.
Good.
Is there anything else you'd like to say as we end the program?
I just would like to say thank you to America.
Well, we are very welcome. We're glad that you're a patriot, and we thank you for the service to this great country and to the world.
Thank you.
You have been a true blessing to this country, and we hope you come back to this program.
Oh, I might.
And I'd like to extend an invitation for you to speak. We have an annual event at our church called the Spiritual Warfare Conference, and I would love for you to come back and speak at that conference.
I try.
But you have to wear your uniform, okay?
That is
You look super.
this is what I wear when I do the parades. I always do the parades with the
Right.
Legion.
You're in the color guard, right?
Yes. And I enjoy doing it. It's a lot of fun.
One other thing I'd like, before we end here, for you to touch on is the fact that how you have instructed your children about God. You mind
Okay.
touching on that?
Sure. My husband is the son of a Methodist minister, and he married this Jewish girl. I would have liked to have been a fly on the wall when his parents found out, but that's besides the point. My in-laws were wonderful people, absolutely wonderful people. I couldn't have chosen better people. They were just fantastic people. We started having a family. We had 3 boys, and we were shipped to northern Michigan. Michigan looks like this. We were right up here. There wasn't a Jewish temple within 100 miles of that, much less a rabbi. So I could not find it that I was capable of educating 3 boys in the Jewish faith and do a good job. I wanted my children to have a religion. I don't care what religion, but have a religion. Believe in something bigger than you. And my husband and I talked it over, and we raised them Methodist. So now my house, when you walk it, I've started to decorate for Christmas since my family is spread all over the U.S. They come home for Thanksgiving, and then they can spend the rest of the holidays with the other sides of the family. And so my husband made me that great big Star of David for the one side of the house, and I have a Star of Bethlehem, a little bit smaller, that will shine down on Joseph and Mary and the Christ child. When I'm done with the decorating, I just got the outside up. So my neighbors watch me do this. I think that's
There she is,
entertainment.
hanging out the window
Hanging
again.
out the window, putting up wreaths. So I enjoy watching my neighbors watching me.
So what I tried to convince you was on the ride over, I told you, Lisa, I do not have a religion. What I have is a relationship with Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus Christ. So,
Yeah,
do you promise to come back to the program?
I'll try.
Okay, that's all I
As long
can
as I'm
ask.
capable.
Well, thank you very much. Give me a kiss.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Danke
It was
schön.
mine. Oh, bitteschön. He says that pretty good.